Thank you very much, Andrew, for this presentation and for this introduction, and welcome everyone. And of course, happy St. Patrick's Day. It's nearly the end of the day for me, but you're only starting St. Patrick's Day yourself. Okay, thank you, Sam. I'll just say next every time, if that's, it's a bit rude, I suppose, but it'll be the shortest way to have the next slide. Okay, thank you very much. So you can have the next slide, please. Happy St. Patrick's Day in all 4 languages, and we'll continue to the next slide, please. So some basic elements, first of all, about the sociolinguistic situation of Breton before I start speaking more specifically about the media situation. Next, please. This is the languages of Europe, just in case you wouldn't have a very clear idea of our little continent. The 6 Celtic languages are, as you can see, on the western fringe of the continent, all of them on the Atlantic fringe, which includes ours, Breton, in the very west of France. Next map, please. This is France now. Oh, did you win before? Yeah, this is France, the hexagon, as we call it as well, and I've situated the map of Brittany in red, as you can see here, and also on the right-hand side you can see the richness of languages. Probably one of the richest member states of the EU is France. Is probably one of the richest in terms of families of languages. We're the only continental language, Celtic language, to still be spoken on the European continent, as you can see here. But there are also Germanic languages, a whole lot of Romance languages, Basque as well, and that's it. Thank you, Sam. Next, please. This is now the map of Brittany proper. On the right-hand side, you have what is now the traditionally Romance-speaking part of Brittany, which we call Upper Brittany. It's a bit the same as the situation in Scotland, I suppose, except that it's kind of more half and half. And in the western part of the country, you can see that we have a variety, of course, of dialects, of varieties of Breton, basically Leon, Trégor, Cornwall, and Vante Breton. But of course, as you can see with the isoglosses, the dialects don't exactly follow the historical divisions, but are more, the situation is altogether much more complicated than that. There's little spots that you can see in the eastern part are places where people who would belong to the, say, revitalization circles are numerous enough to be noted on the map. You have Rennes and you have Nantes and various other places where there is enough maybe bilingual school streams or even bilingual schools, immersion schools, adults speaking the language to be noted on the map. Thank you, Sam. Next, please. This now is a bit dramatic. It's the evolution of the diglossic situation in Lower Brittany, now the western part, between the middle of the 19th century and the end of the past century. You have Breton monolinguals in purple, and bilinguals in sort of a reddish, and then French monolinguals would be in sort of grayish green here. And as you can see, the situation is completely reversed between the say the third part of the 19th century and the end of the last century, and it hasn't changed much since then. Of course, you don't have any Breton monolinguals anymore, but for maybe a few people who've got Alzheimer's disease and have forgotten French. But this is really trivial and very, very, very. You're talking about very few people. Next, please. Now, only once were people asked in a survey in 2007 what variety of Breton they thought they spoke. That was done by a TMO, which is a census or a survey enterprise, which is based in Brittany. It was the only time that happened. So this is why it's a bit old now, 2007. But and it was all done all over Brittany. And this is a reply to the people who say that a lot of people would be speaking Neo-Breton or literary Breton. Only about 2% of people said that they spoke literary Breton, and another 5% didn't know what kind of variety of Breton they spoke. But most of other people would say that they spoke one of the traditional varieties of Breton. Next, please. Now, this is a newer survey, and I will be using it quite a lot in my presentation. This is the survey that was conducted in 2018, and it was probably a more serious survey in the way that over 8,000 people were surveyed all over Brittany, the 5 départements of Brittany, east and west, and according to the rules of sociolinguistic division of age and economic background and cultural background and big cities, small cities, towns and villages and all that. Now, the figures are not very encouraging, of course, because as you can see, and I wrote it in red, the average age of Breton speakers in 2018, which is 5 years ago, was already 70 years of age. And as you can see, in some generations, we have absolutely no speakers at all, or too few speakers to have been noticed by the survey. And it's picking up again with the teenage years and, of course, with children, but children weren't surveyed in 2018. Next, please. Now, one of the good news is that the frequency of use by age group is bigger in the younger generation than it is in the older generation. 69% of people between 15 and 24 years of age returned the answer that they spoke or used Breton at least once a week, and 17% less frequently. And as you can see, it's not the case with the aging population or elderly people, probably because some of them are a bit isolated wherever they live. Even in the countryside now, they might have lost their spouse or maybe their neighbors or their relatives who they used to speak Breton to. Next, please. Now, this is quite a complex diagram, and I'm going to, it was made by a colleague of mine, Erwan Lepipek, and it was published in the International Journal of Sociolinguistics. And it's about what we call the, endogenous Breton as opposed to exogenous Breton. You have a line, an orange line here, which reads Neo-Breton, and in the bottom left part of this diagram, you can see that there are people who have both acquired Breton and Breton that was learned, and that was learned as a native language, and they all belong to what Erwan calls the intellect. And then outside that line, you have what people would call the xenolect, which is completely, maybe very, very different from any sort of traditional Breton in terms of, especially in terms of phonology, but also in terms of lexicon, maybe vocabulary as well. But you have also people who have managed to learn Breton and speak the neo-intellect, which means that they have learned Breton all right, maybe from school or from night classes or long courses, 6 months or 9 months classes, but they have managed to learn a Breton or variety of Breton that's nearly the same as native Breton. Next, please. My own experience now, we're going to go quickly through that because that's not very important. It's just to show you that apart from being an academic in the Breton language, I also have experience in the media. So I'm talking to you as somebody who has worked in the media myself. Next slide, please. So this is when I was young and, my hair was black. I used to be a part-time journalist, and I worked for the news for about 10 years at the end of the past century. Next slide. And I've also been active in as a translator and adaptator for post-synchronized dubbing. We do a lot of dubbing in Breton because it's a lot cheaper than, and it's a lot quicker as well. It takes less time than producing audiovisual material for the televisions and web TVs and so on. And next slide, please. I have also done, Breton dubbing for films, and I've also even played. Well, I wouldn't call myself an actor. This is why there's a question mark there. But I did play in a sitcom that's supposed to be happening in a university with students and one lecturer, and I was that lecturer. I wouldn't call it a piece of art, but it was a sort of it was one of the first sitcoms to ever come out in Breton. So still, Next slide, please. Now, my PhD thesis, as Andrew mentioned earlier on, was on the history of Breton radio and TV programs since the 1960s, and I did a focus on the Breton TV news as well. And I'm still called now and again to train Breton journalists, which I did, for example, for one of the radios and just before COVID. And I am called now and again to be part of festival juries, especially the Celtic Media Festival, which moves from one Celtic country to the next each year and has been in existence for, I think, over 40 years now. Next, please. Now, just to give you an idea about what research is available, at least in Europe, maybe there's more in the US and all over the world, but in Europe, one of the few landmarks that we're still using to this day were the Mercator Media European Network of Researchers, which started as early as 1988, researching minority language media, not just Celtic, but most minority languages in Europe. There was a first symposium in 2003, which is, for 20 years ago. Then there was this book by Mike Cormack and Niamh Horrigan in 2007, which is called Minority Language Media, which I recommend. Still, it's still a very useful handbook to be used for anything that has to do with minority media in Europe anyway. And there's also Tom Moring's research, the Swedish School of Social Science in Helsinki. And I haven't borrowed any slides for this particular work, but and then there's social media and minority languages, Converges and the Creative Industries, which was published 10 years ago by Multilingual Matters. Next slide, please. Now, after Tom Moring, see 7 aspects of minority media impact on language and culture. First of all, a symbolic role for all communities, and especially the Breton community. I'm sure that a lot of people wouldn't even know that Breton is still spoken, wasn't there for the presence of Breton on the media. An economic role, which provides career prospects for young people, apart from teaching, education, which is, of course, represents still to this day more than 90%, even more than that, percent of all jobs available through Breton in Brittany. It also develops a public sphere within the community, which is very important, I find, nowadays, because our Breton-speaking community, between brackets, is very scattered now. It's more like Swiss cheese than anything else. The Breton speakers are all over Brittany, but they might be in small spherules. There's also a representational role, allowing the community to be represented within itself and to outsiders. It also is, of course, a conveyor of culture and a producer of cultural products. It's also an opportunity to use a language routinely on a daily basis. A lot of people don't have access to neighbors or to friends or to relatives who speak Breton, and in that case, the media is their best friend in terms of speaking Breton. And of course, you're talking also about the continuous reconstruction of not just the language, but the language and culture, and the development and diffusion of language, culture, innovation in the changing world. The sitcom I was talking about earlier on, but also other things like long feature films or anything, participate in the reconstruction, the continuous reconstruction of our culture through the Breton language. Next, please. Positioning the subjects of the media, there's a division of functions. The media can be for the community. The plus is then that you can share information and you're countering segregation. You're not in your little box. But then again, you know, maybe you, if your media is too much on that side, then you're verging on integration, but more on assimilation. The media can be of the community. In that case, minorities publish their own media. You participate through group identity, but you can be marginalized. That's one of the dangers. The media can be from the community. In that case, minorities are presented in the main media. You have visibility of the group in the general society, but it can be it can be just a token more than anything else. And when you talk about diasporic media, we're talking about a media that's to the community. The content can be very rich because, you know, especially when diasporas are enormous, like maybe the Irish diaspora, or it's not so much the case for the Breton diaspora. But then in that case, you can just form, again, just little spherules. Next, please. Breton in the press now, and I will have the next slide straight away. Breton in the press, and before that, we need to talk about literacy, because of course, as you probably know, a lot of minority languages and most of the Celtic languages, maybe not Irish, but some Celtic languages like probably Scottish, Gaelic, and certainly Breton, don't show literacy numbers that compare with, say, French or English. Here you have, it's the same survey, the 2018 survey, and you can see that a whole lot of Breton speakers, especially traditional Breton speakers, cannot write their language, and a lot of them can't read their language out. They think that they can't read their language, or a lot of them would just answer that they can read it a little. So you're talking about maybe 14% that read quite well, and only another 14% that declare that they read very well. So of course, it has an impact on the use of the press in Breton. Next, please. Here are two examples of what can be read in Breton by, I would say, two different publics. What you have on the left-hand side is a page of the weekly Le Télégramme, which is mostly in French, and has a Breton column just one day a week on a Thursday. But circulation is quite big, because you're talking about something like probably at this stage about maybe between 150,000 copies to 200,000 copies daily. And on the right-hand side, you have a weekly Breton paper, which is the biggest one. It's called Ja, which means yes. And the circulation is about 1,300 copies. And it's only on subscription. So two different publics. Next slide, please, Sam. Breton on radio now, we'll go on to the next slide straight away. Now, of course, if we're talking about the radio, we need to know how many people understand Breton. Here you have a map of Brittany. Again, Western Brittany speaks a lot more Breton than Eastern Brittany. That's historical. And Central Brittany and also the North Coast has bigger figures than the rest of the country. You are talking about between 10 and 15% in the red areas and 5 and 10% in the orange areas of people who have answered in 2018 that they can understand Breton either very well or quite well. Next slide. Just a few landmarks. I won't read them all, of course, but Breton appeared on television, on the radio during the Second World War. It was created, the first serious Breton programs were created under the German occupation. They were very ambitious, but they were not heard well at all in Lower Brittany because the technically the what do you call that, the emitter, or the transmitter wasn't strong enough. Then there was another landmark after the Second World War in 46 with the Radio Chimère, which was heard a lot more than during the Second World War. And I'm going to go to the present situation now. Since 1982, we have a public state radio that broadcasts about 21 hours, 12 hours of Breton a week. And there used to be bilingual programs, but they disappeared a long time ago. Now, the next slide will show us the situation with independent radio stations, because they're probably even more important than the public service. The first two were created in Central Brittany, and back in 1983, when it was for the first time, radio stations, free radio stations, independent radio stations were allowed by the central government. And it's very important because they were created in parts of Brittany where Breton is spoken, was spoken, and still is spoken on a larger scale than on the coast, for example. And Radio Broadjuenet was especially important to Vante speakers. Vante is the southern variety, which is very different from the other three, and they didn't have their own radio until then. These radios are still working to this day, and in 1998, two more radios were also created, and these are 100% Breton speaking. The first two were bilingual, and they work together a lot and exchange programs, which is very helpful, because they are running on a very small budget, all of them. So by exchanging programs, not only do they manage to fill their schedule, but also they give an opportunity to speak to speakers from various areas to hear the varieties that are spoken in other areas. So that I find that myself very valuable. Next slide, please. This is the map of the four main radio stations, the ones I talked to you about. You know, the ones in purple and blue are the oldest ones since 1983, and they cover areas of northern Brittany and southern Brittany. And in green and sort of brownish, you have the newest ones, which opened in 1998. Next slide. And this is what happens with Radio Carnet. Radio Carnet has decided to open a new station in Nantes, so that's in the south of Brittany. And it doesn't show on the map, but there's also one in Rennes now, which is another big city in the east of Brittany, the northeast of Brittany, and they have their own radio station that opened last year. Next slide. To this day, when you ask the speakers, or when you ask actually everyone, because it's not the Breton speakers, but the population of Brittany, do they know about radio stations? It's still the public service, France Bleu Brésil, 45%, that is best known. Radio Carnet is quite well known. It's in my area here in the south of the Finistère, around where I live, around Quimper. But some of the others are still not very well known, especially Avorig FM. Only 3% of people have heard about it. That's not very much. Next slide. This is the only ever audience survey that was managed to be conducted in 2016 by Radio Carnet, because as you may know, audience surveys are very, very expensive. And of course, radio stations which run on a very small budget are quite reluctant to spend too much money on audience surveys. But I think they managed to piggyback on some other survey that year, and the results are quite interesting because, okay, it's a local radio station, but it shows you that 16 individuals would be listening to the radio every week, and globally 46,000 individuals one time maybe during the year or whatever would at least be listening to that radio. And when you talk about a regular audience, well, it's only 5,000 individuals. And maybe what's a bit worrying, it's all written in French, but I mean, an means ans means years. What's a bit worrying is that the younger generation don't listen so much to Radio Carnet, between 15 and 24 years of age. It's only 6%, and between 25 and 34 years of age, we're talking about a bit more than 12.5%. But at the same time, you have to remember one of the earlier slides, that we have very few speakers in those generations. So it's not that bad, really. They represent quite a bit of the listenership altogether, all the same. Next slide, please, Sam. Now, the use of the Breton language media, remember that this is the same source, TMO Regional Council of Brittany Sociolinguistic Survey, 2018. Over 8,000 people surveyed all over Brittany, East and West. All generations, all sociolinguistic backgrounds, and economic backgrounds, and the rest, of course, gender and all of that. What media are used most by Breton speakers? This is concentrating, of course, on the I think something like between 300 and 400 Breton speakers that were found in the sample of over 8,000 people. So what do they say? They mostly listen to Breton radio programs, sometimes or even often, 18%. They watch TV. They watch Breton TV programs, 17%, and sometimes 41%. They read articles or books in Breton. I was very surprised by that answer myself, because given that there are very few things to read in Breton, unless you get a subscription or you buy books in specialized shops, these must be people who read the Breton column on a Thursday, or maybe people who read some very short Breton articles in the institutional press, what you get from your département or the regional council or that kind of things. Because otherwise, I can't see where they could find enough Breton to read, really. But what you can see here is that websites and using emails or SMS text or social networks, of course, is very small. Remember that the majority of people are over 70. They'd be living in traditional areas, in rural areas. Some of them wouldn't even have the internet at home, or wouldn't even want to have it. So, my young students tend to think that everybody's on the web and everybody uses the internet, but it's not the case when you're talking about the 200,000, the majority of the 200,000 speakers of Breton today. Next slide. Breton radio seems to be more important than Breton TV, even among the younger generations of speaker. This is the basis of this question, that is the 368 speakers. This is all in French, so I'll have to translate, but radio, you can see radio on the third line, écouter la radio en breton, to listen to Breton speaking radio. And you can see that the figures the figures for that, well, of course, the young ones go on websites and communicate on the social media as well. But they seem to listen to the radio in Breton more than they watch television in Breton. And it is even more the case as generations grow older, as we saw earlier on. But it's even even for young speakers, the radio seems to be the most seems to be more important to them than television. Next slide. Breton on television. We'll go on to this next slide straight away. The first ever Breton language program was broadcast in 1964, but these were only 30 seconds weekly, and then 1 minute. When I told you earlier on about tokenistic, the tokenistic approach, that was really the case back in 1964. Gradually, the amount of Breton on television grew and increased until the situation that we have today, where we have a regular weekly children's program, but it's only about 12 minutes, maybe something like that, 15 minutes on a Saturday morning. And you have, well, it's 26 minutes actually, and you have another sort of miscellaneous entertainment program at the weekend, and 4 minutes of TV news from Monday to Friday, but not in the summer. It's interrupted for 2 months in the summer. Next slide, please. We had one very, interesting TV at the beginning of this century, in between the year 2000 and 2003. That was called TV Braise, but it was a failure after only 3 years. For 3 years, we had 17 hours of Breton weekly, which is a lot more than, France 3, the public service, which only has still to this day 1.5 hours weekly, of which 1 hour and 15 minutes of children's programs daily. That was based in Lorient. The money came from the private sector, actually, from Berlusconi, from Murdoch, from a bank called Crédit Agricole, and from TF1, which is the biggest TV network, private TV network in France, even today. But the grid was dramatically revised between 2003 and 2010 in order to satisfy the shareholders. And some films were still dubbed in Breton, maybe once or twice or 3 times a year, but all the other programs disappeared, and they've been replaced by vintage US TV series in French, actually. So the name is still in existence, sadly for us, TV Braise, which means TV Brittany, but the channel has absolutely nothing to do with Brittany or with Breton anymore, and it's based in Paris, and it has no Brittany-related content whatsoever. So next slide, please, Sam. We have one thing which has replaced TV Braise. It's probably more sustainable, at least financially. It's nearly 100% in Breton. It was launched in 2006, so 3 years after the complete failure of TV Braise. It gets subventions from the Regional Council of Brittany. It is useful indeed, but the much smaller. And symbolic impact is also much smaller. The budget is much smaller, and production capacity too. But it is, of course, better than nothing. And there's been contract of objectives and means signed between not only the Regional Council of Brittany, but also the main broadcasters, the other broadcasters, France 3, Brezo Web, of course, and also all other local TV networks, TBO, TV Sud, and TV Rennes. And most Breton programs are now co-productions between all these networks, the public one and the independent ones. Next slide, please, Sam. Okay, and this is I'm coming to the end now. Attitudes and outcomes, and what about the new media? So when you ask people what they would like, are they in favor of more Breton in, for example, more Breton programs on TV and radio? Well, a lot of them would be unfavorable. It's now not just the speakers, but the whole 8,000 plus sample of people who answered the sociolinguistic survey back in 2018. Some of them, maybe half of them altogether, between 39 and 16%, would be rather favorable or utterly favorable to more Breton programs on TV and radio. I don't really know how to interpret those figures. I think that a lot of people think that TV, and especially TV, maybe radio, but TV costs a lot of money. So they wouldn't be prepared to maybe pay towards programs that they wouldn't understand, even though all TV programs now are dubbed, or not dubbed, but subtitled into French. They're more in favor of, for example, French Breton roadsides, or more in favor of Breton classes in schools than they are in favor of Breton programs on TV and radio. Next slide. The media now, as you can see here, there was the potential creation of Breton language related jobs that had been calculated by the Public Office of the Breton language for 2012 to 2017, just to show you that the media doesn't provide very many jobs to young Breton speakers. Most of them, by large, find jobs in education, from pre-primary to third level education, and maybe even adult education, but very, very little in the media, because as you have seen yourself, the media landscape through the medium of Breton is still very small compared to Wales, compared to Ireland, and even compared to Scotland, which has had now BBC Alba in operation since for the past maybe 20 years or so. Next slide, please. So why is particular attention to new media important for minoritized language communities? Next slide. A lot of potential. It maintains the cultural identity, of course. It's good as a diasporic media, but also it's also very good as a super local media, community media, and it forms new types of public spheres and networks, which is very important, as I said earlier on, for when communities like the Breton speaking community is so scattered and so broken into small spherules. Next, please. It has a lot of dangers as well. New boost of hate speech. I mean, some Breton websites are not in them. They get the same amount of hate speech between people who participate in the websites as other, as English speaking websites or anything. And what I called spherules earlier on as being maybe something that can be advantageous can also mean that there's an isolation of minorities into separated spheres. So, to speak on the negative side. Next, please. Now, new media mediatizes fields that have not been considered to be part of the media world so far, such as how people communicate with and within administration and business. Authorities now communicate increasingly often with the public through the medium of the internet as well. What does this mean to the right to use a minority language in communication with the authorities? We don't have that right in Brittany. You may know that. It's every time that there has been an attempt in Parliament to get the right to use a minority language in communication with the authorities, it has been turned down by the Constitutional Court, which is the equivalent of the High Court or the Supreme Court for you in the US. Next slide. Well, we'll go on to the next slide because I think that, I see that the time is, running out. So, conclusion. What the media will not do for Breton or other minoritized languages. Next slide. I'm using Joshua Fishman's word, mass media fetish, which he used in Reversing Language Shift back in 2001. Stage 6 of his RLS scale is vital. First and foremost, the re-establishment of the family, neighborhood, community link. The European Commission's Euromosaic report dating back to 1996 on the production and reproduction of new speakers, which was written by Strubel, who's Catalan, Williams, who's Welshman, and Nelde, who I think belongs to the German-speaking minority of Belgium, gave the media a role of secondary agent, but still behind family, education, and community. So the media can temporarily make up for the lack or weakness of daily social interactions through the medium of the language, but it will not replace this absence indefinitely. And I think this is my last slide. Yes, Trigare, thank you very much.
Let's thank our speaker.
Okay, I can see you all now.
Maybe you could stop the presentation. Thanks. All right. Well, thank you very much for an interesting talk, Stefan. There's been a lot of questions in the chat, so I'll just turn it over. Dee was first, so maybe Dee can go.
Yeah, thank you again for your presentation. It was great.
Welcome, Dee.
I was talking with actually a little bit in the private chat with John a little bit about how amazing your maps are. Just beautiful, gorgeous maps. I had a question. You had a slide on like the age breakdowns of who was listening to the Breton radio stations. And I was wondering if you knew how those compared to the way that people were looking at, to the way that ages were listening to radio in a broader sense. Because like, I feel, so I'm young, I'm 22, and I have a sense that people kind of in my generation and my age range aren't listening to radio a bunch. And so maybe it's not necessarily that there is definitely like a language problem there where like not as many of the young people know the language and aren't listening to the radio, but also maybe young people aren't listening to the radio in general. Like I listen to an obscene number of podcasts though. And so like maybe there's something, and you address this in the new media, where we can meet people in different forms that they're maybe like seeking out more.
Unfortunately, I don't have figures right now. I can find them for you now, I'm sure, about how much radio Breton young speakers of Breton use in French, for example, or in other languages. But I don't have them now, but I can find them certainly and send you another slide for that. But you're right about podcasts. I think that when young speakers answered that survey, they meant including podcasts. Because, you know, yeah, all the radios, I forgot to mention that all the radios that I talked about are also on the internet. So that makes things different, you know. Some people might answer that they use the internet, while actually what they mean is that they listen to the radio on the internet, and maybe not live, but in podcasts as well. So, you know, and I have no way of knowing about that. I don't think that even the people who did the survey could know about that now, because the question was, you know, how expansive one question is one survey, so they wouldn't have broken that into smaller questions. But thank you for your question. That's very interesting.
Thank you. And I definitely do listen to the radio on the internet. We listen to DNR all the time.
Well, that's what I do as well. You know, I mean, that's the problem with media, because now it's hard to know what TV is, what radio is. It's all on the internet. So how do you break that into smaller bits? It's, you know, that's a problem.
I actually have a follow-up to that, because I stopped watching TV during the pandemic. I now watch everything on YouTube. And I was wondering about, are there methods that people can deploy to measure, you know, the consumption in, for example, YouTube rather than traditional TV? And I wonder if the pattern is quite different because of the, you know, YouTube generation that don't even own TVs. They just watch everything on their phone.
Exactly. Yeah. We don't have, I don't have any figures for that, unfortunately, Andrew, no. But there are lots of YouTube, well, lots. There are quite a few anyway, YouTube channels that have been either created by independent people, individuals who want to have their own funny or kind of interesting or historical or whatever YouTube channel, but also everything else. Including the France 3 state-run or public-run television can be found on YouTube as well. A lot of the time, when you don't remember, you want to see a program that you have heard about, and but you don't know, you just know the name, or just know, you dial it on your computer, and it happens to be on YouTube. So yeah, everything is blurred. I'd say a lot of people like yourself, I did the same during the pandemic. I switched to YouTube and all that, and not live TV, because we had so much time that we could and we didn't know when day and night were. Basically, we could watch a lot of things at different times. So, but I don't have any figures, unfortunately. No, I don't have, and I don't think they're available. The problem with YouTube and with the web in general is that when you count, it's like when you count clicks, it's, you don't know how much people have been watching the YouTube channel that you're talking about, and that's a problem.
I have a YouTube channel for syntax, and it can actually measure from me. I don't think anyone else can see it. I can see the average duration for each video, how long they spent on each video. So I wonder if there's a way to gather that data.
Yeah, I'm sure they will, because at some point the broadcasters will want to know how many people actually watch, and the figures from old time TV won't be good enough. So yeah. I'm sure there'll be a way.
So I have two more, since I'm talking, I have two more questions, and I'll turn it over to other people. Preferably the students can ask questions too. One is, and I think the answer is you don't know yet, but I'm wondering about the differences post-pandemic, because the pandemic, as you noted, has switched our media usage. If we see any, if you see, maybe you can speculate about whether or not there's been an increase in media usage because of the pandemic itself.
No, again, the sad thing about Breton media, and this is why I'm trying to use every little source that I have, but you've probably noticed that some of my sources are old now. Even the survey is kind of the big survey that we had in 2018 is 5 years ago. No, we're actually working in the dark, and the journalists themselves are professionals who work in Breton language media are sad about this as well. They know that we don't have they don't have figures, you see, because even, for example, France 3, which operates mainly in French and has Breton language slots, don't they measure within an hour. So, for example, they wouldn't even know how many people watch the 4 minutes of Breton news, because that's within an hour of a lot of French, 56 minutes of French and 4 minutes of Breton. So it's very difficult to know exactly if things have changed since the pandemics, because we don't have, the figures are so few, very, very, very few.
So, and I have one more follow-up. So I wonder if you could, it's also a speculation question. I wonder if you could comment on, why is it the case that Scotland, Ireland, and Wales have dedicated television stations that run for either most of the day or all of the day, and have been relatively successful? I mean, even English speakers watch them. Not in huge numbers, but they do. And I sort of wonder, why did it fail in Brittany?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, if we're talking about S4C, Channel Pedwar Cymru, the Welsh channel, the oldest among us will remember certainly the campaign. There was a huge campaign, and they managed to actually get a public channel run on public money from Margaret Thatcher, of all people. So, it just shows you how big the campaign was back then. A member of parliament threatened to go on hunger strike to get the channel. So, you're talking about a huge campaign that was very successful. Actually, Ireland, which is an independent republic, had to wait for another 14 years before getting TG Cahir on in 1996, which is now which used to be it used to have another name back then, Television Gaeilge. But so that's not that easy even for people who actually have language rights in an independent republic. What happened in Scotland was different, I think. Scotland is, as you know, in Scotland, there are even fewer speakers than in Brittany. Here, something in the region of 50,000 or 60,000. But way back at the end of the last century and beginning of this century, there were a whole lot of programs scattered all over many stations. Maybe 3 or 4 or even 5 TV stations, and the BBC finally, together with the Scottish government, decided that it was time to regroup all that into one proper channel, and also they profited from the fact that they took advantage of the fact that TV was now becoming sort of a mixed up with radio and with the web and all that, and it was a lot easier and a lot cheaper to run than it had been before, prior to that. Now, what happened with Brittany was that we had high hopes with TV Bryce, but we knew that there was no way that the private sector would lose money for more than 2, 3, maybe 4 years in something that should be supported by public money. So we had hoped back then that maybe the French government would have thought that, okay, it was high time to give an opportunity to one of the languages of France to get their own TV station run, because we had showed that it worked. It worked technically. Professionals had been trained. The public was enthusiastic about it as well. But the public had to pay back then because it was a private channel, so you had to pay for your subscription. But everything else had been proved. We had proved that it could be workable. But in France, for a lot of things, with schools, the press, a whole lot of things, you won't have support from the central government. And our regions are very poor. The budget of the region of Brittany is 1/20th of the budget of the Welsh Assembly, and it's 1/70th, I think, of the budget of the Scottish Parliament. So even if the regional council wanted to have their own their own television, they couldn't possibly allow enough money to it. Like the Welsh Assembly or the Scottish Parliament, sadly.
Interesting. I think John is next. Are you still there, John?
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your presentation.
Welcome.
Yes, and thank you for coming to our group. One of the things I was thinking about as you were going through your presentation is something that we noticed throughout a lot of the Celtic languages. You have this dichotomy between the older speakers who self-identify as less familiar with the literacy, and then the younger generation who, to the extent that they know, the language, consider themselves more proportionally literate. And I was kind of curious when you were talking about, sort of the consumption of print journalism within Breton. I was curious about that situation, because some of the things that I've noticed, like thinking about the history of literacy and within the Gaelic context, how people were, of course, they would be punished for using their language, and they were denied any sort of literacy. For those who were learning, who were enrolling in the schools in the 50s and 60s or whatever. And then the literacy came later, and so there's always sort of been this sense that even though there's a lot of people of those older generations that that can read the language, there's sort of like this I don't know if sort of this belief that they can't, that they're not literate in the language. And I was wondering if there's analogs or there's parallels within the Breton context as well, where even those, and you can't tell this from the survey data all the time, I understand, but if at least even anecdotally, if people who say that they're not literate in the language tend to actually be more literate than they claim.
Yeah, I think you're dead right, because, well, first of all, literacy used to be learnt until maybe the Second World War through just only one medium, and that was the Catholic Church. People would go to church, and they'd have prayer books, or they'd even hear the what do you call the priest sermon in Breton, and they'd have the Life of the Saints at home, and that'd be probably the only book in Breton in most of the families. So there was for a long time the support of the Catholic Church, but that sort of ended after the Second World War, when the Catholic Church themselves turned to French after Vatican II. You probably heard about Vatican II. It's was a big what do you call that? Assembly of Catholic hierarchy, and they decided to change to use and use the language of the people. But because Breton had kind of started to come out of use, and to get out of use in Brittany, the church changed from Latin directly to French instead of using Breton again. So there was a gap. There was at least 2 generations gap of people who didn't really know where to turn to get literacy through Breton. And there is this idea, of course, through punishment at school and all that of course they don't know how to read Breton. Some people would even be convinced that you can't write Breton, even though it was written way back in the Middle Ages, and you have written Breton from the 9th century and all the way. But a lot of people would think that. And then what changed again, I think, is that when they saw signposts on the side of the road appearing, and they could more or less understand what was written on the signposts, then they realized that they could read Breton, more than they thought they would. A lot more than they thought they could, actually. You have to remember as well that the Breton print, Breton orthography is a lot closer to the way we pronounce Breton than, for example, Irish. As an example, it's more like Welsh in that respect. It's more transparent, so to speak. I would not that Welsh is that transparent either, but in Wales, as you know, because of the Bible, they've known how to read for a number of centuries, which was not the case in Catholic countries, because the Bible was being interpreted by the priest for them, and they had very little printed material in the houses. But they did until the Second World War. Yeah.
Thank you,
Mike.
Am I here? Am I out? Hey, that was great. I have a question. You mentioned at one point you were talking about people claiming they were reading stuff, but you weren't sure what they could be reading. And I was thinking about a thing in Wales, something called a papur bro, which is like a regional newsletter. And I think it's like, like some, as far as I can tell, some little old lady, like, Xeroxes a bunch of things, staples them together, and they stick them in the local bookstore. They're extremely local, and really inexpensive, as far as I can tell, to produce. And I'm wondering, and they seem to be successful. I'm wondering if there's an analog to that for Breton.
No, I know of Papere Bro, of course, but we don't have the equivalent, sadly, Mike. No, there used to be back in the 30s, maybe the 40s, a little bit into the 50s. There used to be what they called Canadic, which is the little how would you say that? Publisher, or the little postman or something like that, which used to be the missionaries, Breton missionaries in Africa, for example, giving news, and that would be extremely local as well. You'd have Canadic and then the name of a little town, but that disappeared a long time ago. And the reason why I gave you those two examples on the same one slide, on the left hand side, the daily French newspaper, and on the other side, the only weekly we have, is that this weekly, which has a circulation of 1,300 copies a week, is the biggest circulation of all printed media that we have in Breton. So, this is why I'm so surprised. And this is why I think that it must be the Telegram. The Telegram actually, once, way back, maybe 20 years ago, when they started that column, they wanted to know, was it read or not? And they had just once they asked their readership, did they find it useful, or did they try to read it? And 20% back then of the readership returned a yes answer. So this is why they kept the column, I think, because they think that, well, okay, people might not read it completely, but they might try. So this is very useful in that respect, because you're talking about, as I said, 160,000 copies a day. So that means that a lot of elderly people they get the newspaper at home, and they will try and read it.
So just a related question. I mean, if I think about Wales, and I could be just completely wrong here, as I am about so many things, but if I think about Wales, I heard once that the most widely read thing in Wales is the cyfansoddadau, the report on the who won what at the Eisteddfod every year. So they put that out, at least they used to put it out in print, and apparently people would like buy it up and it would go out of print immediately. But it's an odd thing to read, right? I mean, at least it seems odd from an American perspective, right? Instead of like reading the local news, they want to know, maybe they want to know which choirs won the choir contest, or who won the best poem in which category. Maybe they're reading it for that local bit of news.
Right. Well,
but there's no equivalent to that in Britain.
No. Well, we don't have anything as big as the Eisteddfod. We have the Interceltic festival in Lorient, but it's mostly music, and there's no poetry, and there's no. We have what we call Connar Bob, which is much more recent than the Eisteddfod. It's been going on for maybe 40 years or something like that, and the results would be more kind of a broadcast on the television. The prizes would be sort of on stage, and people would watch that. But we don't have the equivalent of the Eisteddfod, and poetry in Brittany doesn't have the same high status as it has in Welsh and in Wales by any stretch of the imagination. No.
Thank you.
We have questions from Sam and Kevin, and let's do Sam first because I know she has to leave.
All right.
Hi, Stefan. Thanks again. That was really great.
Thanks to you, Sam. Thanks to you for the slides.
Thank you for coming. My question is about the relationship, or maybe potential relationship, between you were talking about sort of the media as the secondary agent to things like community, family, like everyday transmission of the language in those types of environments. Is there a way, or is there a world in which you see those things as potentially like mutually reinforcing, given that both are not, at their full strength that we would like to see them at? If you're in this type of speech community where there's, maybe not as much community transmission as we'd like to see, but also a small but maybe growing media program, is there a way that those can sort of be leveraged to reinforce one another until we can get to this more desirable stage of revitalization?
Yeah, well, I think that maybe I didn't stress that enough in my presentation, but I think that the media is a place, so to speak, where it's one of the few places where traditional speakers and non-traditional speakers can meet, even if they meet sort of virtually. First of all, they meet in physically, because you have young journalists or young reporters or whatever who go out and see and actually speak to the traditional speakers and realize then on both sides that they can understand each other because they conduct the interview through the medium of Breton and it works. So that's proof that it can work. And then virtually, the two communities meet in the cyberspace, so to speak, or in through the airwaves, because they are together in the same program for an hour or whatever, and it works as well. You know, I mean, you may have some elderly speakers being interviewed, and then later on about the same subject, you'll have a teenager, and you'll have someone from a city and someone from the, you know, the rural area, and they kind of meet together virtually. So yeah, I think that in that way, they bring together not only varieties of Breton, but speakers who would maybe not make the effort in the everyday life to get to know each other, to go to speak to each other. First of all, they wouldn't even know who speaks Breton, you know. But then in the media, they do meet in a virtual way. Yeah, so that does have an effect, I think, especially for such a scattered community of speakers that we have in Breton. It does have an effect, yeah, and a positive effect of all things.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Kevin.
Bye. Have to go.
Kevin.
Oh, a comment about radio and television, and then a couple of questions. In Scotland, we've got Alba, or as it's called in the south, Alba, the TV station, and we've got a pretty good Radio na Gael radio station. I was brought up in the south of Scotland, worked for 30 years at Solomore Ostig, and you get the radio and TV coming around quite often. The few times I've appeared in a Gaelic television programme, nobody sees it at the college. Whereas when I go south, people I know that don't know any Gaelic, they've seen it. Loads of people, more people without Gaelic than with Gaelic, watch the Gaelic TV because it's got subtitles. And in fact, the complaint is that you can't switch from Gaelic speakers as you can't switch the subtitles off. Even people in the north of England watch it because it's got good music. Whereas anytime I appear in the radio, I go into the college, I heard you on the radio this morning and whatnot. People listen to it when they're doing their breakfast, or eating their breakfast, or driving into the work and whatnot. So there's a difference. The television is important for symbolism, for getting the message to a wider public, but for the Gaelic community, the radio is much more important. Anyway, the questions, since COVID, there's a new media. I'd never heard of Zoom before 3 years ago, or even used Skype. But for Scottish Gaelic, there's a lot of, there's a sort of community of Zooms. I've just come from a weekly Friday Zoom, Cape Breton pop-up Gaeltacht every Friday, an average of 20 people every week, small chat rooms, great. And tomorrow we've got another one, a regular weekly one. There's various other ones. I don't know about so much in Irish Gaelic. Maybe what partly drives it in Scottish Gaelic is we've got just caught in time by Zoom, a Gaelic community still speaking Gaelic in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton in Canada. And so that unites people a lot. I was wondering if there's anything like that started in Breton. And finally, just a quick technical question. French has got loads of accents of every kind. French computer keyboards, notorious for any non-French speakers. But one it doesn't have is N tilde. I wonder if that technical thing is hampers not people in casual conversation, but people doing some serious writing and wanting it to look good in Breton.
Right. Yeah, well, we've got the same problem with subtitles on Breton television. You can't take them off. You can't take them off. They're they're on screen, and you can't use your remote control to take them off. So that's of course it has brought more audiences to the Breton programs at the weekend, but that's at the detriment of the pleasure that you get as a Breton speaker. As your eyes go down to the bottom of the screen. So yeah, there's been complaints about that, but that hasn't changed anything. What you said about the radio reminds me of the Irish situation as well. I mean, the people who listen to Radio na Gaeltachta are not the same basically as the ones who would watch Tiji Cahir, because there are much younger audiences, I think, watching TV, and also people who don't have much of a command of Irish. I'm sure now, I mean, we have no figures again, but I'm sure that a lot of people watch television in Breton just because they like the content of it, the music, the reports and all that. And because, but that happens with radio as well, mind you. The radio that I mentioned earlier on, which is called Radio Carnet, has a very modern, a very contemporary approach to music. They have a very, very rich playlist. It's not at all traditional Breton music. So it brings people in that don't mind that the rest is in Breton, but what they like about it is that they might find new gems of whatever, rap or rock and roll, or or R&B or anything else, and they will listen to, and of course give better audience figures to that radio just because they like the music on it. What you said now about the keyboard, because I'm using Mac, it's very easy to use the N tilde on Mac. All you have to do is, it's very quick, really. I don't know if that deters people from writing in Breton. Maybe that wasn't the question, but I wouldn't say that the N tilde would be an obstacle. It's kind of quick. I don't know for computers that are not Mac, but I think it can be easily done as well. Going back to your question or your comment about Zoom, I'm not aware myself of Zoom groups that would meet on a regular basis in Breton, but I wouldn't be surprised at all, because there are so many things happening with Facebook groups and Instagram groups and all that. I know that there are also groups for that in Welsh, so I wouldn't be surprised at all that if this existed. I know of one thing that is very important that hasn't been mentioned yet, neither by me or by any of your questions yet, and it's voice synthesis. And for a long time we were very sad, because we thought that this was not going to happen in Breton because it's so expensive. It used to be so expensive and so technically difficult, and now it is happening. It is actually happening. A young person has found a way to have voice synthesis in Breton progressing. And all we have to do now, I mean, I'm saying that as if that was very easy, but all we have to do is to feed the monster, to feed the beast, like with plenty of voices and accents, and maybe including French accent on Breton, that exists a lot. But and at some point, in the foreseeable future, apparently we'll be able to have voice synthesis and voice recognition through the medium of Breton, which was only a dream about 2 or 3 years ago. So that's good news.